Before Noah, before the Ark became one of the most famous stories in the world, another flood survivor was already written into clay. His name was Ziusudra, and his broken tablet opens a mystery older than Genesis. The flood story feels familiar because it has been told for so long. A righteous man is warned, a vessel is built, animals are saved, the waters rise, the old world disappears, birds are released, dry land returns, life begins again. For many people, that story begins with Noah. But in the clay libraries of Mesopotamia, the same pattern appears in older forms, with different names and different meanings. One survivor is called Ziusudra, another is Atrahasis, another is Utnapishtim. Each belongs to a different layer of ancient memory. Each stands at the edge of a world that the gods decide to erase. This is why the flood before Noah is not just a comparison between stories. It is a journey through how ancient civilizations remembered catastrophe. The texts are not clean. The tablets are broken. The copies are separated by centuries. The gods change names. The moral logic changes, but the structure keeps returning. That is the mystery. Why did this story survive so many transformations? Why did scribes keep copying it? Why did a flood become the line between the world before and the world after? The answer begins with a tablet, damaged but not silent, from a land where water created civilization and could also destroy it. The Sumerian Flood Story survives in fragments. That fact matters. We do not have a perfect book waiting on a shelf. We have damaged clay, copied by scribes, buried, broken, recovered, and read across thousands of years. The surviving Sumerian text is associated with Nippur, one of Mesopotamia's great sacred and scribal centers. In that text, the flood survivor is Ziusudra. His name is often understood as meaning something close to life of long days, a fitting name for the man who survives the end of an age. The tablet does not give us every detail we want. Lines are missing. The beginning is damaged. The shape of the divine decision has to be handled carefully, but enough remains to see the outline. A catastrophic flood is coming. A human receives warning. A vessel preserves life. After the flood, the survivor receives extraordinary favor. This is the first mood the episode has to hold, evidence and absence at the same time. The oldest layer is not a neat script. It is a wounded object. That makes it more powerful, not less. When viewers imagine the flood before Noah, they should not see a clean modern illustration first. They should see cracked clay under museum light, with just enough signs surviving to tell us that long before later scripture, Mesopotamian scribes were already asking how life continued after the waters. Southern Mesopotamia was a civilization of water. Cities depended on rivers, canals, marshes, irrigation, and the careful movement of water through fields. Without water, grain failed. Without grain, cities could not feed workers, priests, rulers, or scribes. The same rivers that made urban life possible also carried danger. Floods were not abstract symbols. They were part of the landscape. A river could nourish a field one season and swallow a settlement another. Mud brick walls, reed houses, storehouses, animals, and seed grain all depended on a fragile balance. That is why a flood story in Mesopotamia is never only about rain. It is about control failing. The canal system, the city wall, the temple economy, the king's authority, the scribe's records, the family's animals, and the field's harvest all stand in the path of water that no human can command. The Sumerian flood tradition belongs to that world. It transforms a real fear into cosmic drama. The disaster is not simply a local river breaking its banks. In the story, the flood becomes a judgment on the whole human order. This is where myth becomes larger than memory. Real floods may have shaped the imagination, but the story turns water into a question. If civilization depends on forces it cannot fully control, what happens when those forces are released against it? The Sumerian King List gives the flood a different kind of power. It is not only a story about one survivor, it is a way of organizing time. In the King List, kingship descends from heaven. Cities receive rule. Kings reign for impossible spans before the flood. Then the flood sweeps over the world. Afterward, kingship is restored and descends again. To modern readers, the giant reign lengths can look strange, even impossible. But that strangeness is the point. The King List is not a modern archive arranged by neutral historians. It is a political memory machine. It gives kingship a sacred origin, follows it from city to city, and turns catastrophe into a boundary between mythic time and later dynastic time. The flood becomes a hinge. Before it, the world feels vast, remote, and almost superhuman. After it, rule continues but under the shadow of interruption. Kingship survives, yet only because it is imagined as something that can be taken away and returned. That is a crucial idea for the video. The flood before Noah is not just a disaster. It is a break in history. It explains why the old order vanished and why the new order still claims legitimacy. The Sumerian King List makes the flood a wound in time. The Akkadian Atrahasis epic gives the flood one of its most disturbing forms. In this version, the story begins with labor. The lesser gods are tired. They are burdened with work. Humanity is created so humans can carry the load. At first, people are useful. They feed the gods through offerings and support the divine order. But then humanity grows. People multiply, cities become louder. The human world expands until the noise rises upward and disturbs the gods. Enlil, one of the great divine authorities, cannot rest. He responds with escalating disasters: plague, drought, famine, finally flood. This is not the moral universe most viewers expect. In Atrahasis, destruction does not begin because humanity is described as evil in the same way Genesis describes corruption and violence. It begins because humans are too many, too loud, too disruptive, too difficult for the divine order to tolerate. That is why Atrahasis should sit near the center of the film. It is unsettling because it makes human life itself feel dangerous. Civilization succeeds, multiplies, fills the world with sound, and that success becomes the reason the world is nearly destroyed. The mystery is not just why the gods send the flood. It is why an ancient culture imagined humanity's growth as both necessary and unbearable. In the flood traditions of Mesopotamia, survival depends on knowledge. The divine council may decide destruction, but the survivor lives because the secret does not stay sealed. In Atrahasis and related traditions, Enki, also called E in Akkadian, finds a way to warn the human without openly betraying the gods. This is one of the most cinematic moments in the entire story. The warning is indirect. It can be imagined as speech to a reed wall, a message delivered in a form that lets the god obey the letter of the divine restriction while still saving life. The human hears what he needs to hear. Build, prepare, preserve what can be preserved. Enki matters because he is not only a water god. He is wisdom, craft, cleverness, and survival intelligence. If Enlil represents overwhelming command, Enki represents the hidden path through disaster. This gives the flood story a moral tension before the flood even begins. The gods are not all one voice. Divine power is divided. Destruction and preservation come from the same sacred world. Human survival depends on a crack inside the divine plan. That crack is where the story breathes. Without the warning, the flood is only annihilation. With the warning, it becomes memory. Someone will live to tell what happened. Every flood story eventually reaches the same practical question. What can be saved? The boat, ark, or vessel is more than a means of escape. It is a temporary world. Inside it, the future is compressed into a fragile space. People, animals, food, craft knowledge, seed life, memory, and obedience to a warning that others may not believe. In Mesopotamian versions, the construction details change across traditions. The boat can be imagined in different shapes and scales. Later Babylonian material even preserves striking details that do not match the rectangular ark many viewers picture from later art. That variation is important. The story was not frozen. Scribes and communities reworked it. They preserved a core pattern while changing the vessel, the divine names, the survivor, and the meaning of the flood. But the emotional structure remains stable. One human prepares while the rest of the world continues. A private act of construction becomes an answer to a cosmic decision. The vessel is built before the evidence arrives. This is why the boat is such a powerful image. It is faith, fear, engineering, and memory at the same time. Ancient flood stories do not only ask why water destroys. They ask what kind of knowledge lets a world survive when everyone else still thinks the world is normal. The flood itself is the moment when human order fails. The city has walls, streets, temples, storehouses, records, and names. It has families, animals, fields, and rulers. It has rituals that repeat and accounts that balance. Then the waters rise, and the systems that seemed permanent become temporary. This is why the visual language should stay human scale. A flood over Sumer should not look like a fantasy explosion. It should feel like mud brick streets filling with water, reed bundles breaking loose, storage jars floating away, temple platforms standing in rain, and people realizing too late that the ordinary world has ended. In the stories, the flood is cosmic. In the image, it must still be concrete. The viewer should feel what is being lost, not just land but order, not just buildings but continuity. Ancient Mesopotamia was built from fragile materials. Mud brick returns to mud, reeds tear loose. Clay tablets survive only when accident and heat preserve them. Even memory needs conditions to last. The flood turns that fragility into drama. The old world disappears underwater, and for a moment the story becomes almost silent. No kingship, no city noise, no fields, no temple routines. Only the vessel, the storm, and the question of whether anything human will remain. After the waters, the survivor becomes more than a survivor. Ziusudra stands at the boundary between two worlds. He belongs to the age before the flood because he lived in it. But he also belongs to the world after the flood because he carries memory across the break. That makes him a threshold figure. The Sumerian tradition gives him extraordinary honor after the catastrophe. Later traditions develop different forms of that idea. Atrahasis survives. Utnapishtim receives immortality. Noah receives blessing and covenant. The survivor is never merely lucky. He becomes the witness who proves the world was not always this way. His life says there was a before. His survival makes an after possible. This is a major reason flood stories last. They are not only stories about destruction. They are stories about continuity after destruction. The whole human future depends on a narrow passage through chaos. The vessel lands, but the world is not simply reset. Something has changed. The gods have acted. Humans have learned that civilization can end. Memory now contains a scar. Ziusudra's power is that he carries the scar. When we look back from later traditions, His name may be less famous than Noah, but in the older Mesopotamian landscape, he is one of the first figures through whom the flood became a story humans could remember. The flood takes on another meaning in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is not looking for flood history at first. He is looking for a way out of death. After the death of his friend Enkidu, the king of Uruk is terrified by mortality. He journeys beyond the ordinary human world to find Utnapishtim, the man who survived the flood and was granted a life beyond normal human limits. That narrative frame changes everything. The flood story becomes a lesson told to a desperate king. Utnapishtim is not only a survivor of water, he is a witness to the limit of human ambition. Gilgamesh wants what Utnapishtim has, but the story he hears does not give him a simple path to immortality. It shows him that even the greatest catastrophe did not remove the basic truth of human life. Everyone dies, cities fall, kings become stories, only memory struggles against disappearance. That is why Gilgamesh Tablet XI matters so much. The flood is no longer only a civilization reset. It becomes part of a meditation on death. Utnapishtim's survival is extraordinary, but it does not become a general solution for humanity. Gilgamesh reaches the flood survivor and still has to return as a mortal man. The flood teaches him that survival is not the same as escape. Some details in flood stories are so specific that they feel like fingerprints. Birds are one of them. In the Gilgamesh flood account, Utnapishtim releases birds to learn whether the waters have receded. In Genesis, Noah also sends birds from the ark. The details are not identical, but the shared motif is striking because it is practical, visual, and emotionally clear. After a world of water, a bird becomes a test of land. This is one of the easiest connections for viewers to understand, but it still needs careful handling. A shared motif does not prove a straight line from one surviving tablet to one later text. Ancient stories moved through oral retelling, scribal copying, translation, adaptation, exile, empire, and religious reinterpretation. The better claim is stronger because it is more careful. Gilgamesh and Genesis share flood motifs that belong to a wider ancient Near Eastern story world. The bird detail is one of the clearest signs that these stories are in conversation with older narrative patterns. It is also beautiful. A bird leaves the vessel and enters a silent sky. For the first time, survival becomes visible. Land is possible. The world may be wounded, but it is no longer only water. That small flight carries the whole emotional weight of the flood tradition. Fear, testing, waiting, and the first hint that life can begin again. The flood story did not survive because one tablet remained untouched. It survived because scribes kept copying, translating, teaching, adapting, and reusing it. Ancient Mesopotamian scribal culture was not passive storage. It was active memory. A scribe learned signs by copying older texts. A school preserved tradition while also shaping how future readers encountered it. Stories moved from Sumerian into Akkadian, from older forms into later literary compositions, from temple and palace contexts into broader cultural memory. This is why the flood survivor changes names. Ziusudra, Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, and Noah are not simply interchangeable. Each belongs to a different textual world, but they occupy a similar role, the warned survivor who carries life through a catastrophic break. That role was useful. It allowed cultures to ask why the gods destroy, why humans survive, how kingship returns, why death cannot be escaped, and what kind of covenant or order follows disaster. The story survived because it could answer different questions in different ages. This is the opposite of a frozen myth. It is a living tradition written in dead clay. Every copy is an act of preservation, but also an act of interpretation. By the time the story reaches later readers, it has already traveled through the hands of many people who did not simply repeat the past. They made the past speak again. When the flood appears in Genesis, the structure is familiar, but the meaning is transformed. Noah is warned, an ark is built, animals are preserved, the waters rise, birds are released, the flood recedes, sacrifice follows, a covenant is made. But the reason for the flood has changed. In Genesis, the problem is not human noise disturbing the gods. The problem is violence, corruption, and moral disorder. The flood becomes an act of judgment within a monotheistic world, followed by a covenant that places the future of creation under a divine promise. That shift matters. It shows how an old story pattern can be given a new theological center. The Mesopotamian versions often involve divine plurality, disagreement, irritation, regret, and clever survival. Genesis recasts the flood within a different vision of God, justice, human wickedness, and renewed creation. This is why the video should avoid the shallow line that Genesis simply copied Sumer. The real story is more interesting. Genesis participates in an older ancient Near Eastern flood tradition, but it changes the meaning of that tradition. It gives the flood a moral architecture that is distinct from Atrahasis and Gilgamesh. The echoes are real. The transformation is real too. That tension is where the history becomes worth telling. When the flood versions are placed beside each other, the shared pattern becomes clear. A divine decision, a warned survivor, a vessel, preserved life, rising water, a landing, birds in some versions, sacrifice after survival, a new status for the survivor or a new order for the world. But the differences matter just as much. In Ziusudra, we are dealing with a fragmentary Sumerian tradition where the oldest details are partly hidden. In the King List, the flood divides kingship and time. In Atrahasis, human noise and growth provoke divine disaster. In Gilgamesh, the flood survivor becomes a teacher of mortality. In Genesis, the flood becomes moral judgment and covenant. The same structure carries different meanings. That is what makes the flood before Noah such a strong hidden tablet topic. It is not only older than many viewers expect, it is layered. The flood story is a container. Each culture pours its own fear into it. One fears disorder among the gods. Another fears population and noise. Another fears the death of kings. Another fears human violence. Another wants to explain how divine promise follows destruction. The question is not whether one version is real and all the others are fake. The better question is what kind of story can survive so many worlds and still remain recognizable. Archaeology adds another layer, but it does not give us an easy answer. Excavators in Mesopotamia found flood deposits in some ancient sites. Layers of silt and water damage can show that real floods affected real communities. That matters, because the flood traditions did not arise in a landscape untouched by disaster. But the evidence is not one clean universal layer spread across every site at the same time. Flood deposits can be local. Rivers can change course. Cities can experience different disasters in different centuries. A layer at one site does not automatically explain every flood story in the ancient Near East. This is where the video has to be disciplined. We should not claim proof of a worldwide flood. We should not reduce the stories to pure fiction either. The stronger position is that Mesopotamia's lived experience of dangerous rivers helped make flood catastrophe imaginable, and myth turned that experience into a cosmic story of destruction and survival. Local memory can become universal language. A river flood can become the end of the world when it is told by people whose world is the city, the field, the temple, and the family buried under water. The archaeology does not solve the mystery. It sharpens it. It shows us that ancient people had reasons to fear water, and that their stories transformed fear into a memory large enough to outlive the cities themselves. The flood survivor keeps changing names. Ziusudra appears in Sumerian tradition. Atrahasis belongs to an Akkadian epic whose name means exceedingly wise. Utnapishtim tells the story to Gilgamesh as the deathless survivor. Noah stands inside Genesis as the righteous man of his generation. These names are not cosmetic. Each name comes with a world. Ziusudra belongs to broken Sumerian clay and the deep memory of early Mesopotamia. Atrahasis belongs to a story about divine labor, human multiplication, and the danger of noise. Utnapishtim belongs to the search for immortality. Noah belongs to moral judgment, covenant, and a renewed creation. The role remains, the identity changes. That is the core mystery. Why does the warned survivor survive the transformations of language, religion, and empire? Why does this figure keep appearing at the edge of catastrophe? Maybe because every culture needs someone who crosses the break. When a world ends, the story cannot end there. It needs a carrier, a witness, a person who remembers what was lost and makes the future possible. The survivor is the bridge between disaster and meaning. That is why he can change names and still be recognized. The name belongs to one tradition. The role belongs to something deeper in ancient memory. The flood story traveled through a world of cities, empires, languages, and scribes. Sumerian did not remain the everyday language of Mesopotamia forever, but Sumerian learning remained prestigious. Akkadian became dominant in many contexts. Babylonian and Assyrian scribes copied older works. Libraries preserved story, whose roots reached deep into earlier periods. Then empires rose and fell. People moved, texts moved, ideas moved. The ancient Near East was not a set of sealed cultures. It was a network of trade, war, exile, diplomacy, scribal education, conquest, and translation. Stories could travel because people traveled, tablets traveled, and traditions were taught to new generations. This matters for biblical echoes. The question is not whether one scribe sat with one tablet and copied it line by line into a later text. The history is more complex. Flood motifs belong to a shared cultural world, and those motifs could be inherited, challenged, transformed, and recentered. That is why the flood before Noah should feel vast. It is not just Sumer to Bible in one straight arrow. It is a long river of memory running through many channels. Some channels are visible, others are lost. The tablets we have are only part of the story. The missing tablets, oral tellings, school exercises, and forgotten copies may have carried just as much. The flood story traveled because ancient memory was never still. At the end, we return to the broken tablet. That is where the strongest version of this story lies, not in certainty, but in survival. The Sumerian flood story is damaged. The King List turns the flood into a break in time. Atrahasis makes human life noisy enough to disturb the gods. Gilgamesh makes the flood survivor a witness to mortality. Genesis transforms the flood into moral judgment and covenant. Across all of them, the pattern remains. The world is threatened. One human is warned. Life enters a vessel. The waters rise. The old order vanishes. Something survives. A new world begins under the memory of what was lost. That is why Noah was not the first flood survivor in ancient literature, but he is part of a much older and larger story. The flood before Noah does not make the later story smaller. It makes the history bigger. It shows that ancient people were already wrestling with catastrophe, justice, divine power, fragile civilization, and the terrifying fact that the world humans build can disappear. Maybe that is why the flood story refused to drown. It could change names. It could change languages. It could change gods. It could change meanings. But as long as people feared the end of their world, they kept returning to the same question. If everything is swept away, what is worth saving?